1987, when there was an incentive to give early in 1986 for tax benefits. So this is only the second year that there's been a decline in giving reported. Last year, Giving USA had estimated a drop in giving, but several large bequests pushed the total given from a decrease to a slight increase. This histogram shows you, in blue there, inflation-adjusted dollars in recession, and current dollars, the line trailing up through the histogram there. Basically, a good visual of how giving tracks what's going on in the economy in this country, with giving growing much slower in those recession years. So those organizations this year that were particularly hard hit were those that typically receive gifts for capital, for endowment, for long-term planning, that is education, arts, foundations, public society benefit, which are those freestanding donor-advised funds such as Fidelity and Schwab donor-advised funds, as well as the United Ways, the UJFs. Those were particularly hard hit. Those that showed growth were typically those charities, and Patrick will talk more about the recipients and how the sectors changed. But those that did well or that showed growth were typically those that were immediate services, such as frontline services, human services, health, international aid, and even environment, showing an increase. Why did giving decrease? Last year, as we're all aware of what's going on in the economic environment, GDP was down 3.6%. Personal income and the stock market are two key indicators of giving and giving behavior in this country. Personal income was down 1.7%. The stock market was up 23%, but given its performance over the end of 2008 and for the year in 2009, the market only was up to its 2003 value. So stock market and personal wealth, two important indicators in giving, both lower than in years. Why didn't giving decrease more, you might ask? If you remember the last quarter of 2008, when our economy is so hard hit, and for those of you who are fundraisers or development professionals, you've probably tried to block out the last quarter of 2008 out of your mind. But in that last quarter, when things sort of tanked, because of that quarter and because the organizations typically receive up to 40% of their giving, of their charitable gifts in the last quarter, those organizations were particularly impacted. There's many reports that are showing increase toward the end of 2009 as the market improved, which could have helped the year overall. Another factor which likely kept the numbers from falling further was that 85% of the workforce continued working, and the industries that lost the most jobs, construction, manufacturing, were those industries that tend to hire the people that are not donors anyway. So it wouldn't have had a large impact on those workers and their gifts. Women are 50% of the workforce, and employed women are some of the most likely donors. And then the last factor that probably helped giving not decline as much as it could have is that there were 5 individual donors that gave a total of $1.6 billion. And without those 5 gifts, giving would have been down another 1% in current donors. So that's a big amount of money, $1.6 billion given by those 5 donors. Nearly all that money went to foundations, and so charities haven't seen the benefit of those gifts as of yet. So, while Giving USA reports the numbers in aggregate, we do recognize that there are individual organizations whose experiences were very different than the numbers that we're reporting today. As a practitioner, a consultant who works with nonprofits every day, I know that 2009 was a tough year and that 2010 continues to be a challenge. That said, we are seeing many organizations that are raising significant dollars because they're effectively communicating their message, and donors are responding to that need. I hope we can have more of a discussion about that today after our remarks. What does this mean for you? What does this mean we need to be doing in our organizations? So, as you hear from Patrick on trends in giving in this country and the details of these Giving USA numbers, I encourage you to have hope. I'm probably the only one on the panel today that's going to talk about hope. In my job, it has to be glass half full, so I'm going to tell you to have hope. I'm seeing very positive signs. I'm seeing donors giving for the organizations that are raising money in the right ways. I think we're moving in the right direction. History suggests that giving will improve as the economy improves, and this recovery may take a bit longer, but in our work we are seeing signs of improvement. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Patrick Gurney, and I'm at the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University, and we're proud to be the research partner of the Giving USA Foundation for doing this work for the last decade. Giving USA has been doing this work for 55 years, and so we have a long cumulative knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, and trying to understand, explain, and predict these things. And we'll be very transparent about some of our concerns in the forecast, but also what we think are some of the the solid aspirational things things we're highly confident about, some of the things that we're more worried about in these types of things. Wendy mentioned September, the last quarter of 2008, and I had the honor and the privilege of being named the executive director of the Center on Philanthropy in September of 2008. Started September 1, and a mere 2 weeks later, the stock market collapsed and started a downward death spiral that was lots of fun to go through that ride. And our endowment and earnings went down very dramatically. We also earn, most of our revenue is earned income and endowment income, and so like most charities, we've had to make some significant adjustments in terms of budgeting and staffing, and so we've experienced this roller coaster with most of you. This pie chart that's up is one of the key pie charts for Giving USA, and so I just want to take a second to go through this. One of the things that's absolutely fascinating to me, though, when I came to the Center of Philanthropy, this pie chart was one of the most surprising things to me. 75% of all giving comes from living individuals. Okay? So this checkbook giving from households who are alive. Another 8% comes from individuals who have recently passed. So you add that up, if math is right, that's 83%. Okay? Well, then you look at family foundations, 13%, and that family foundation, or that foundation piece, which includes family foundations, is the fastest growing piece of the pie. Over the last 20 years, their share of the pie has doubled. Okay, went from 6% 20 years ago to 13% today. About half of those gifts are given by family foundations where the family founders are still making those decisions. Okay, so we add the half of that to the bequest, to the individual giving, the inter vivos giving. Together, that's about 89%. So almost 90% of 9 out of $10 that's given is coming from individuals who are alive or who have recently passed, whether it's through their family foundations or through their checkbooks. So I think that's an important thing to note. Corporate giving has been very steady at 4, 5, or 6% for the last 40, 50 years, and this year it's at 4%. All right. As Wendy mentioned, this 5 donors who each gave over $100 million, collectively they gave $1.6 billion, is one of the reasons why household giving did not decline last year in inflation-adjusted dollars by our estimates. So we have to keep in mind that in Giving USA, we're estimating total giving and giving by all the different subsectors and average rates of change. Okay, so I want to say up front, we understand that your organization may not have experienced the exact same things that Giving USA did, reports. In fact, I would say probably exactly nobody experienced the exact same thing that Giving USA is reporting overall. Right? These are averages aggregated across 1.5 million charities plus or minus, and aggregated across hundreds of thousands of donors and corporations and foundations who are making individual decisions. So we're reporting the averages, we're reporting the aggregates, and we think it's useful for the individual charities, the individual nonprofits, but it may not be your exact personal experience. 3 of the sources declined. Surprisingly, corporate giving, we estimate, went up last year. This is based, we believe, this is based largely on the fact that many producers are giving more in kind goods and services. So again, the corporate giving increase is a good thing. However, not all charities benefit from that, and not all charities can use the in-kind goods and services that were donated as well. Sources of contribution. If we look at giving overall, again, decreased 3.2% when you adjust for inflation. And I just talked about these individual pieces, holiday giving, corporate request giving, and the Family Foundation grant making. So I'm going to skip that right here and here again because I want to allow as much time for Q&A and the other panelists. Where does the money go? 1/3 of all the giving goes to religious organizations. Now, 20 years ago, this was 50%. 40 years ago, this was 50%. Does that mean that giving to religion is going down? No. The mathematics of this are a little tricky, but if you hold with me for a second, this is the difference between the averages and rates of growth, right? So, on average, charitable organizations have had a faster rate of growth than religious organizations. And so, on average, the piece of the pie going to religious organizations has decreased. Giving to religion over the last 40 years has grown normally, actually decreased last year, but most years it continues to grow. It just grows at a slower rate. Our other research, not related to Giving USA, but some of our other research shows that each successive generation since the Depression era, the silent generation, each successive generation, including boomers, is attending mass, mosque, synagogue at a lower rate than their parents and grandparents. And guess what? If you don't attend religious services, you're probably not giving to religious organizations. In fact, in our Center for Philanthropy panel study, we do find a very small percentage of non-believers, atheists, agnostics, and others who don't participate in any way by their self-revelation actually do give a little bit to religious organizations each year. I call that insurance. You're laughing. Humor is always risky. But you know, the main point here is that giving to religion is still the dominant recipient type of organization. Education, second largest, 13% of the pie. One of the fascinating things about the Giving USA pie chart, though, is giving to grant-making foundations is the 3rd largest recipient set of organizations. So high net worth households and ultra high net worth households are giving so much directly to their family foundations that this is the 3rd largest subsector in terms of where do the dollars go. Now, in Giving USA, we measure this and we report that, understanding that not all those dollars are re-granted that year. Some of them are. Sometimes the foundations are simply a pass-through conduit to the recipient organizations, but other times those dollars are invested and 5% is paid out over time, but those dollars do go out over time. Going around the horn, human services, public society benefit, health, arts, culture, international, environment. We've added a new category, foundation grants to individuals. 1% of the pie. We've added this, and granted 1% is small, but we've added this because a number of foundations now are making direct donations to individuals, and pharmaceutical companies and their grants are providing drugs either for free or greatly reduced price. But this has become a significant enough pattern that we've started isolating this and reporting this. The unallocated giving, 10% of the pie. We think it's important to report that there's 10% that we can't really account for. And this comes from a couple of different things. When we measure the sources of philanthropy and the uses of philanthropy, they're coming from different pieces of data. So you wouldn't really expect everything to add up to be exactly the same, and it doesn't. But it's actually pretty close. Those differences are only about 2%. But what we find is that because some donors give more than they can legally deduct, that is, you can only deduct 50% of your adjusted gross income, your AGI, in any given year. You can carry any additional donations for 5 years, and you can only deduct 30% of gifts to your family foundation, of 30% of your AGI to a family foundation in any given year. Again, carry forward for 5 years, but it's important to note that those types of things create a difference between the sources and the uses, so that the source side is reporting this in their tax return, but they're only reporting a part of it because they can't deduct all of it, whereas the charities are getting all of it in any given year. Similarly, Senator Grassley has tried to cut down on this, but if I donate my classic Porsche, I might value that at more than the nonprofit organization values that at, and so that's another possible reason for unallocated. Where'd the funding go? I think it's important to note that, and Muddy mentioned this a little bit too, that some of the sectors that saw decreases were organizations like education, arts and culture, and so on. Some of the more larger organized philanthropy. And now I work for a university, okay, so I'm not going to say giving to universities giving education is not important during recessions. But I think that many donors made decisions that on the margin, it was more important to give those who are hungry, those who are homeless, those who have been afflicted by disasters, to give additional dollars to those individuals and their families, rather than giving additional dollars on the margin to organizations that are in higher education, arts, and culture. Again, we have to be careful because there's a core level of philanthropy that's going to arts and culture and education throughout the business cycle. We don't want to minimize that or diminish that in any way, but at the same time, I think people are making some decisions on the margin about where to invest those dollars. Let me skip to some of this. This is, normally we don't tout other people's research, and so in an ecumenical moment, I'm going to, yeah, I grew up Catholic and still am, so here we go. We have GuideStar here, and GuideStar does a survey, or does a poll of charitable organizations, and this is, self-reporting. But one of the things that you see is that the brown band on the top is the percentage of charities that reported a decrease in their charitable receipts in that year. And on the bottom is the green band that said it increased, and the yellow in between says it stayed about the same. All right? Fascinating things. And every year, some say it goes up. And every year, some say that it goes down. And some also say it stayed the same. Okay? Guess what? That's reality. It's messy. It's ugly. It's hard to predict. Okay? But things that we can note that are different is that during recessionary years, 2001, 2002, and 2008, 2009, the percentage who reported increases were smaller than the percentage reporting increases during growth years. Conversely, those who were reporting decreases had a higher percentage reporting decreases in recessionary years and lower percentage reporting decreases in non-recessionary years. Okay, so again, this is casual empiricism suggestive of the fact that people are not giving because of changes in the economy, but the amounts that they're giving do vary with changes in the business cycle. Okay? People are not saying, I'm going to stop giving altogether, typically, but they're adjusting how much they give as we move through the business cycle. One of the things we've seen from looking at the data historically and using the Giving USA data is that typically during the recovery, philanthropy recovers and returns to what it was before the recession began. However, it takes 3, 4, and even 5 years to recover to where we were before the recession began. So this is not to be doom and gloom, and I share Wendy's optimism and Stacy's optimism for this year and next, but I think we also have to be realistic that when there's a reduction in philanthropy, there's pain and suffering in the nonprofit sector. And more importantly, there's pain and suffering for the different constituencies the nonprofit sector serves. Okay? So most of those cuts happen in staffing cuts, and that means that there's fewer people to help feed the hungry, house the homeless, and so on. So I think that we want to be realistic about this. We think the recovery will happen. We think that the recovery in philanthropy will parallel the recovery in overall economic forces, but it may take a little while, 3 to 5 years. All right, adjusted for inflation, this is a little interesting, I think, to look at what are the rates of change over the last year and then the prior 2 years and the cumulative effect. So total giving in inflation-adjusted dollars last year fell 3.2%. The year before fell 2.4%. The cumulative effect 5.5%. Now, one of the things the year before, and you're going to see when we see the bequest data, is that we had estimated that bequest giving had declined slightly. There were 2 large charitable bequests that came online late in the year that we didn't know. And this is one of the things that's difficult about estimating bequest giving is we know that every year there are a lot of people who die and who leave small charitable bequests, right? And that goes on. But whether or not you see an increase or a decrease in charitable bequest giving is largely driven by a few hundred of the wealthiest individuals who died that year, and whether or not they're philanthropic and how philanthropic they are. Okay. Well, last year, and then also how long it takes for that to go through probate. Okay. So last year there was a very wealthy estate. When you look at the state level data, there was a very wealthy estate in New York, and you might guess who that might be. And that popped the numbers for 2007 to 2008, which then meant 2008 was an artificial high, and we returned to that to the kind of a normal range in 2009. You see this bequest giving. So in 2000, from 2007 to 2008, you see a 30% increase. There was also a large estate that was went through probate in Arkansas. Okay, well, you guys, we don't know precisely who these people were definitively, but we can maybe do the math magic on this and make some guesses. But then this last year, we see a decline of almost 24% in inflation-adjusted dollars in bequest giving. Okay, so this bequest giving was volatile and is largely driven by these 2 estates. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. But that's the reality of trying to do this work. Right, where'd the money go? Again, religious giving, if you think about giving to religion, is kind of like the tortoise and the hare, and it generally does not decline much, if at all, during recessions. But at the same time, it tends not to grow very rapidly during the growth recovery phase. Okay, so you got to keep that in mind. And heuristically, that makes sense to me. If you think that you ought to tithe periodly, because in any period because of your religious values, that you're going to continue tithing during recessions. Now, how much you have to tithe from will go up and go down with your earned income, and so you see a little bit of that going on. Education, we mentioned before, went down, as did public society benefit and giving to the arts. Again, these are large institutions, for the most part, who actually get a large share of total philanthropy, have well-organized fundraising and development offices, but at the same time, I think people were making some decisions on the margin to give to human services, health, and international affairs, which includes international relief organizations. I'm going to skip this just for a second, but again, I want to stress the fact that our estimate is that when adjusted for inflation, household giving did not change, but that was very much affected by these 5 gifts of $100 million or more. If you absent that out of the equation, then household giving would have dropped by about 1% as well. This slide is not normally in the PowerPoint deck for Giving USA, but I think that this is illustrative because it shows the Giving USA initial estimate is the light blue bar. The black bar in this histogram is the IRS maximum amount that was allowed to be deducted, okay, for that year. So this gives us a comparison of what the IRS said was allowable and our initial estimate. And then the gray bar to the right of the black bar is the total non-cash and cash giving, which includes amounts that had to be carried forward, because to the extent that that gray bar exceeds the black bar, that's the amount that is carried forward each year. Well, a couple things to point out about this. One is that in almost every year, Giving USA slightly underestimated the IRS actual totals. We use fairly conservative methods. We'd rather be a little conservative than expressing exuberant expectations on this. But I also want to say that in almost every year, we're within 2% of where the IRS comes in at after the fact. Yet, in 2002, we overestimated it a little bit. I think this was a little bit of a 911 effect. We tried to estimate based on what charities were reporting they were getting for 911 gifts. We add that on to the total, and we overshot that a little bit. And in 2005, I want to point out, was the one year that we were off a little bit more than normal, and we're still not off that much. But that was because we did not try to make any estimation for the Tetra provision that year of the IRA rollover, and that was intentional. We had, there was no history for doing that. It turns out that turned out to be pretty substantial. Okay, and so we underestimated giving that year more substantial than we did in other years. I love this graph. I've paid 3 different econ doctoral students over 3 different summers a lot of money by their standards, not very much by yours, I'm sure, to try to figure this out, try to develop a forecasting model. And this is tough work because at the end of the day, it's driven by changes of a few hundred households when they die, whether or not they're philanthropic or not. But what we see is, there's a core level of charitable bequest giving that goes on, and the secular path for that is upwards overall. As societies become more wealthy, more money is being left for charities and charitable bequests. But at the same time, these spikes are hard to predict, and that makes our job a little bit tough. Total giving is a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product. So here's the good news. Last year, in spite of the recession, giving remained above 2% as a percentage of GDP. This is the 10th year in a row that GDP has been at 2% or higher. That's wonderful, something to be celebrated. But I think one of the problem areas for the nonprofit sector is you look at this for the last 40 years, and we can extend it back for 50 years, and it's the same thing. Philanthropy as a percentage of GDP, you put this on a bar chart up to 100, that's a straight line, right? We've not moved the dial at all. Okay, so what's the, and I'll use Business Week speak for a moment, what's the value-added proposition nonprofits need to offer to society to move that from 2% to 3%, much less 5%, or the biblical tithe of 10%? Pardon the colloquialism, but we ain't close, right? So I think it's an interesting question. I don't have the answer. I wish I did. But I think that this is, something for us to think about, discuss, and debate. Household giving is a percentage of personal income and disposable income. And by disposable income, I mean after-tax income. This is not after you buy your car, buy your house, and things like that. Those are personal choices, and I don't care how you spend your money. But I recognize that you can't give money that you don't have because you paid in taxes. Okay? So we're looking at it as after-tax income. Again, 2.1%, okay, a good result given the recession and all that. At the same time, we know from our survey research of households that about 1/3 of households don't give in any given year, and about 2/3 do give. That means, so if you add in the zeros from the 1/3, so you take out the zeros from the 1/3 who don't give at all, then those households who are giving at all are giving about 3% of their income. Okay, but then 1/3 of the households are not giving anything, and that's where you get the 2%. One of the things that we've done is research on what drives changes in household giving, changes in corporate giving, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we found that was a little surprising was that changes in the S&P 500 is the single biggest predictor of changes in household giving. It's also the single biggest predictor of changes in foundation grant making, right? Because foundations are required by law to pay out 5% of their asset base, and many of them have diversified portfolios in the stock market. Well, when you look at this individual giving, the lighter line, versus the stock market, the S&P 500, the orange bolder line, what you see is the S&P 500 and individual giving move in the same general direction. Stock market goes up, giving goes up with a little bit of a lag, but it doesn't go up as rapidly. Conversely, when the stock market goes down, individual giving also goes down, but again, with a little bit of a lag and not as dramatically. This is probably a good thing. If charities' income revenue budgets from philanthropy exactly parallel the S&P 500, think of the volatility we'd have to deal with, right? We'd have to have all sorts of temporary workers and contingent plans, and so I think it'd be pretty difficult to plan a budget. But at the same time, I think it's very illustrative to show that in our society, when we add wealth, we tend to give more to charities. Corporate giving as a percentage of pre-tax corporate profits, 40-year average, 0.9%. We're just slightly above that at 1% this year. There's this artificial spike in 1986 because corporations and high net worth households pre-gave in 86 in anticipation of the reduction in tax rates in 87 as part of the Tax Simplification Act. And so you had an artificial spike in 86 and a decline from that in 87. but we're chugging along at 1%. Is that enough? Is that too much? Those are normative questions. I'm going to report what is right now, and we can discuss what ought to be perhaps during the Q&A. The Corporation for National Community Service has engaged BLS and CPS to do surveys of households' volunteerism for the last several years. And because volunteerism is part of philanthropy, and we think it's an important part of philanthropy, we've added in a little bit of information about that. What's fascinating to me is only about 26% of households, about 1/4 of households, volunteer at all. Okay? You have 2/3 of households donating, so you have a much higher rate of civic engagement through philanthropy in the giving form than you do the volunteering form. The number of charities, again, keep in mind that this does not include an estimated 350,000 religious organizations that are not required by the IRS to file IRS 990's informational tax returns. But you see a fairly steady growth in the number of charities. Kirsten Gromberg on our faculty has estimated in Indiana, though, that this number is probably wrong by about 1/3, underestimating by about 1/3 the number of organizations, the kitchen table charities, that are not reporting, most of them small, but are large enough now they exceed $5,000 a year in total revenue that should be reporting. At least this is what she's found in Indiana and in Illinois. We think that this is probably common nationwide. Whether or not this is too many nonprofits or too few, I think is a fascinating conversation for discussion, debate, maybe during the Q&A, or one of our other panelists may address that, so I'm not going to touch that right now. But you see a growth in the number of nonprofits. I will point out that the amount of growth in the number of charities pretty much parallels the growth in the amount of total giving over the last several decades. And so what you see is Americans are saying, I'm pretty comfortable with specialization and division of labor, that diversity of the nonprofit sector is an okay thing, and I'm going to give to support specialized cancer research centers as opposed to just cancer research overall. I'm going to support a local food bank as well as a national one and so on. So I think that that's part of what's going on. All right, well that ends my presentation for now, and turn over to Tom.
Well, thank you. Let me begin by talking about what the Giving USA report tells us about the present. All in all, I concur with the other panelists that this is good news for the sector. We survived the heart of the recession. The sector battened down its hatches, cut spending, and survived the gale. Preliminary data from my organization, the National Center for Charitable Statistics, paints a similar picture. Overall, and excluding congregations, private contributions account for approximately 14% of the sector's total revenue. When we exclude hospitals and higher ed, they account for approximately 25%. However, these percentages vary substantially by subsector. In the arts, environment, and international development subsectors, private contributions represent between 40 and 70% of the revenues of the average organization. For the typical large human service or healthcare organization, private contributions may well account for less than 10% of their total income. Thus, to fully understand the impact of the recession, one needs to look not just at private contributions, vital as they are, but also at the bottom line. One needs also to look at total revenue and revenue in relationship to expenses. We don't yet have a full picture of the picture of expenses of nonprofit organizations in 2009, but we do have some preliminary data on their revenues. What we see is from the 1/3 of organizations that have filed 2009 returns to date, is that revenues declined more or less at the same level that one sees for private contributions. We found that in current dollars, total revenue declined overall for the sector about 5%. Arts and culture and education took the worst hits of the major subsectors, but overall the picture was not nearly as bad as many of these smaller scale surveys would indicate. However, this fails to capture the extent to which the recession's impact was felt differently by different organizations. Only about 45% of the organizations in our study showed declines of 5% or more in revenue, while a surprisingly large 33% actually showed increases of at least an equal amount. Assuming that the typical organization was reasonably well managed and able to cut its expenses in line with its revenues, it seems safe to assume that the overwhelming percentage of organizations survive the year. But now for the future, and what I think is the bad news. The sector survived the gale, but many organizations appear on course to sail into a hurricane. Government remains a key source of funding for the sector. With the current level of pressure on state, local, and federal budgets, human service organizations in particular, and weaker organizations in other subsectors that have depended on government funding will face enormous pressures to substitute private contributions for declining government funding. Seen from one perspective, the relative stability of private contributions over 40 years is highly encouraging. But juxtapose these numbers with the increased need for our nation to work together to solve major public problems in education, the environment, healthcare, international development, the threat of nuclear terrorism, and growing violence and disorder along our southern border. Add to the mix the public's lack of confidence in government and the limits of government resources. Taking all this into account, a very different picture emerges. Our nation is in dire need of solutions. Neither business nor government seems to have the wherewithal. One of the best ways to restore confidence in our public world and our democracy is to give people the experience of working together for the public good at a local level, as slow and difficult as it often is. As de Tocqueville understood, this is the role best filled by the nonprofit sector. But clearly the sector needs more resources. I don't believe we're going to get there by focusing more on acting like businesses and generating new sources of earned income, popular as that approach is in the sector. Instead, private contributions need to fill this gap. Every year, the IRS publishes data on individual tax returns for each state. And every year, the average contributions for individuals, as Patrick pointed out, the average contributions for individuals who itemize their returns is in the 2 to 3% range nationwide. Yet one state consistently stands out when we look at the numbers at the state level. That's Utah. Mormons are accustomed to tithing, to giving 10% of their income to their church. From my perspective, it seems like it ought to be possible to create a new civic religion, one built on a nonprofit sector that works close to the ground, that demonstrates results, that collaborates aggressively for the public good, and that shows the sort of public service-oriented commitment to the greater good that has long been the defining characteristic of the sector. When one looks at surveys looking at public confidence in the sector, the statistics are good, but not great. My sense is that if the sector could work more diligently to create a public service ethos, then we could begin to generate new levels of volunteering, and we could begin to turn those volunteers into new contributors and to truly double the level of contributions over the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
I'm always trying to figure out what it is that Bill has asked me here to do. And today when he said, well, you're going last, I figured I knew. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is my sense of, there's a British saying, what is that when it's at home? When you kind of in a very complicated way described what's going on. You have to know what it is when it hits the ground before you really know what it is. And so I think actually we've gotten a very nuanced view. Patrick, I think you did a fabulous job of describing what it is what was behind the numbers in the study. But I want to talk about what this actually means for nonprofits. As Tom said, individual contributions are a small part of the nonprofit economy, a small but extremely important part of the nonprofit economy. We also have the federal budget and state and local budgets. We have, there's individual fees. these are also extremely important parts of the economy. And these have also been affected by the economy in a very serious way. So what we find when, the Nonprofit Quarterly really prides itself on having ongoing conversations with its readers. And most of its readership is executive directors of small to mid-sized organizations across the country. And so what we try to do is kind of track what it is that people are experiencing on the ground. And so here's the picture that I see. And I think it's reflected in the numbers to some extent, which is that there are large parts of the country who are getting it, who are experiencing the recession in a way that's much more serious than other parts of the country. So part of the way people experience the recession is geographically driven. Part of it, as we can see from the Giving USA numbers, is field driven. So if you happen to be in a field that isn't in particular favor or on everybody's radar screen during a moment of recession, and the your state and your locality is suffering from a lack of tax income, what you're going to find is that particular segment of the nonprofit sector is going to go wanting. So I'm going to talk to you about one particular segment, which I think is extremely important, and just to give you an example of what I mean. In some areas of the country late last year, what we found as we were tracking was that there were a lot of child care agencies that were in very serious trouble. And they obviously weren't in serious trouble primarily because of individual contributions. They were in serious trouble because of a combination of fees, individual fees, and government supplements, supplements to those individual fees. And there were many nonprofit child care organizations that went under late last year because of this. That is such critical infrastructure for community, and yet we saw in many states huge numbers of child care organizations going under. So as we look at the giving and we say, oh, it's not that bad, we'll rebound, what we have to realize is that some of what we're losing is infrastructure that is going to cost us a lot to rebuild, and that truly matters to communities, so that as jobs begin to reappear, where are the child care structures for those jobs? In states where the revenue base is in really serious trouble, that also have, they've lost a good number of the corporations that pay into that revenue base. There's a kind of cascade effect that, United Way money goes down, individual giving goes down because of joblessness. And it's just kind of cascade. So these multiple areas, when people don't have jobs, they don't pay the fees for the arts organizations or the child care organizations. So there's a cascade effects that happens to some organizations where literally every single source is affected. And in some cases, those organizations just simply gave up the ghost. So we can look at it and we can say, well, there's numbers of organizations who have actually increased their revenues over this year, and there are. But some of this really is so sensitive to the geographic and the field placement of those organizations. And I think it's important that we understand that we are losing valuable community infrastructure. To some extent, there's been a little bit of a shell game as well. I mean, we've watched, part of what I think people are experiencing is extraordinary fits and starts in their revenue. And so it's not like you can kind of predict, oh, we're going to be able to bring in, $230,000 worth of private contributions this year. At the beginning of this year, it was really anybody's guess. At the beginning of last year, it was anybody's guess. And so there's a level of anxiety, and particularly when there's a lot of different revenue streams that are affected by the recession, there's a level of anxiety in organizations that may lead to people painting a more disastrous picture than what they actually have. But in fact, for a lot of organizations, we do have a fairly disastrous picture. When we look in a little bit more into the numbers, and we see that some of those private contributions have gone into foundations where they're sitting, and they're not getting out into communities. And we look at the corporate contributions and see that a lot of that was in-kind donations in a few particular categories, and otherwise you would have seen a real reduction in those areas. We understand that these numbers are a little bit obfuscating. They don't show you the real picture unless you get right down into them. And then you understand that not only do we have these decreases of more than 10% in whole categories of organizations over the past 2 years, but that those decreases actually were much worse in some areas of the country than they were in others. And so you will get organizations who say, we had losses of 30, 40, 50%. We had to close our doors because we literally could not keep our budgets going any longer. And, so that you do have these big, these portions of the nonprofit sector that have literally disappeared. And I do think, I think in human services and I think in the arts, that's absolutely, I hear it every day. And then you hear the creative strategies, the entrepreneurial strategies that people are putting to work around trying to keep life and limb together in those organizations. And you're convinced again that, we will come out of this, we're resilient. But it does lead me to feel like, there's some things that are not being attended to here. And one of them is philanthropically underserved areas. And particularly where philanthropically underserved areas are combined with areas that, states that have bad economies, you've got a very serious situation. And I do not see philanthropy really addressing this at this point. I think that it absolutely needs to address it because we're just going to make things worse if we do not address the fact that in fact some of the losses may be being felt much worse in areas that were already underserved philanthropically than areas that were somewhat comfortable. I do want to say one thing which has been interesting to me to watch. We have an article in this issue of the magazine by Clara Miller called "The Four Horsemen of the Nonprofit Financial Apocalypse." And it talks about that for a lot of organizations, their level of fixed costs and restricted money were so high that being able to respond to this recession was extraordinarily difficult for them. And so there is also a piece in here about giving unrestricted money during periods of time when that are fairly unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen from one month to the next. And giving unrestricted money actually allows the organization to put its best judgment to how it's going to handle the bit of money that it has for the best interest of its community. One of the interesting things that she said in there is that, and I think this is true, this has been true in my experience, is that this has been a recession that has not just hit small organizations. In fact, a lot of small organizations have been fairly agile, and they've been able to be agile during this period. They still have, numbers of volunteers. They don't have high fixed costs. And a lot of the organizations that have been most badly hit are some of the kind of mid-large size organizations that had high building costs, high debt, had tried to be somewhat entrepreneurial and gotten themselves in a bind, and actually got caught maybe mid-campaign with a big key contribution going south. And then just getting stuck. One organization like that I've talked to over the last 18 months is an organization in Chicago that's a big senior services organization, got caught right in the middle of developing a assisted living facility. And it just absolutely ground to a halt. And so they've been paying the freight on this half-developed project, waiting to hope that the recession is going to is going to wane a little bit so that they can begin to bring the investment money in again. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are some sectors that have been hit much worse than others. Some areas of the country, particularly rural areas, philanthropically underserved areas, that have been hit much worse than the rest of the country. We need to be paying attention to a couple of different areas in the very immediate future. One of them, and I just have to, I have to really emphasize this, is there's this cliff for a lot of state budgets at this point. That, the end of stimulus money, and there's a question in the Senate right now about whether or not they're going to authorize the extension of expanded Medicaid payments. That is a huge issue right now for the sector. There's somewhere, I think, in the area of $89 billion of a gap in across the state budgets at this point, cumulative gap. And this would account for about a quarter of that. But the degree to which it would temper some of the cuts is really, extraordinary. We have to keep an eye on kind of that mix and what's actually happening out in the field, because these kinds of discussions are great, but the fact of the matter is, if there's been a lot of contributions and it's parked in foundations that don't intend to give it out at a level more than 5% year by year, that in fact doesn't provide very much solace for us right now, for grassroots organizations across the country. So I've done my last point. I think foundations need to be paying out at a much higher rate than 5%. Particularly now, I think that the rationale for it is right there in our face. I think we need to pay attention to those underserved areas, and that we need to be, much more we need to be more trusting that grassroots organizations know how to spend their money and stop restricting money into program-specific chunks, because that is going to serve nobody's purpose right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. Those were excellent presentations, and I can see people already have questions, so I'd like to go to those right away. Who wants to go first? And could you get the microphone so that the people who are hearing the stream can hear you?
I wanted to ask Ms. Cambridge, at what rate do you think foundations can give sustainable?
Oh, I would love to hand that over to Pablo. I think, yeah, actually, just let Pablo answer that question.
Well, I think the NCRP, that is National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy's position, is a reasonable one, and that is 6%, but all in grants. And if you think about how much money that would provide the nonprofit sector, additional money, we're talking in the region of $10 billion new dollars. The Obama administration, unfortunately, doesn't understand that, and so they're putzing around with tiny social innovation funds and hoping that they can persuade philanthropy and foundations in particular to give more money. That's how they could do it. Take the bully pulpit, push the Congress to pass a 6% in grants measure. That would do an enormous amount of good, not only for grassroots, but for arts organizations, for universities, for all sorts of organizations.
Could I make a comment on that too? So, I think one of the things that I think rather than saying 6% across the board, I think one of the things that would be more helpful to society is to say that in bad times, you can have a higher payout rate. So it becomes, foundation grant making becomes a counter-cyclical tool, so that in bad times, maybe it's 7 or 8%, and then in good times, maybe it's 3 or 4% to offset that, because 3 or 4% in good times would throw off, a reasonable amount of cash, but 7 or 8% in bad times would throw off cash when society needs it the most, not only as a counter-cyclical tool for the overall economy, but to feed the hungry and house the homeless at a time when there's more of those people who have more of those needs. And then we can argue whether that averages out to 5 or 6%. I actually think that's a valid argument, but I think that using foundation grant making as a counter-cyclical tool is an area that hasn't really gotten enough attention.
Please identify yourself.
Sure, I'm Bill Huddleston. I do consulting about the Black Federal Campaign. It's nice to meet you face to face.
No.
We've had many emails. I know most of you on the panel. Two things. One, going to Tom, your point of whether it's a civic village or not. I think one of the things the sector needs to do a much better job of is agreeing on something and making it more visible. So my personal submission for that, or I'll give that, is literacy. Because it doesn't matter if it's conservative or liberal, anywhere in between, in terms of, if you have somebody that was, for example, sent to prison 10 years ago for smoking a joint, they're about to be released. And I think as a sector, we would say literacy is something that everyone should be involved in. Doesn't matter if you read books or blind, it doesn't matter with kids or adults who don't. As a social good, it's better to be able to know how to read than not. And so that's one space, maybe you can put an open thread or discussion on the website. As many of you know, I do consulting with the federal government. Just to let you know, I just got these results 48 hours ago. The 2009 results for the CFC were overall 2.4% increase, $282 million. It's organized by state. I bought copies for panelists. It's the world's largest supply of unrestricted money.
Great. Hector?
My name is Ray Foote. I'm with the National Parks Conservation Association. What does the report have to say about, specifically in the area of individuals, about things like median gift size and percentage of households giving? So moving away from gross dollars and averages, but more to major gifts or smaller gifts. What if anything, are you seeing in that?
Yeah, that's really not the domain of Giving USA. So because we use IRS tax data to forecast household giving and corporate giving and so on and so forth. The Center for Philanthropy does research on household giving, it's a separate part of our work, and we have a panel study where we follow the same 8,000 households, survey them every other year with the University of Michigan's panel study of income dynamics about their giving and volunteering behaviors. On average, 65 to 70% of households donate in a typical year. The most recent year for which we have data, the average household gift among those who gave anything was about $2,300. So that's that's pretty consistent. I mean, what we see is one of the things that's interesting though is over a 3-year period, we survey the same households, and you can only do this with a panel study. 1/3 of households don't donate each year, but 15% across 6 years never give a nickel. So these are hardcore non-donors, right? So I mean, you can sign all the mailings you want. You can call them a lot of times, and you're just wasting your money. 56% gave every year, and 29% moved in and out of the donative market. And so one of the things that we see though is as educations increase of these households, they're more likely to be persistent donors. As income increases, they're more likely to be persistent donors. As wealth increases, as employment status. So I mean, things that kind of intuitively make sense. Those who are wealthier give 3 times as much as those who earn less than $100,000 a year. again, not a big surprise, but these are kind of correlates. And a lot of the work that we do, I think, is we're testing folklore and myth, and a lot of times there's truth to some of the folklore and myth, but sometimes we find some surprises as well.
I will say anecdotally, all of the charities that we talk to, when we ask them for their giving figures, they're all saying the median gift size is dropping. I don't think I've heard too many that say it's increasing, so it does seem, at least just anecdotally, that it's dropping.
Before the recession started, there was lots of interest in philanthropy, and I think that interest was growing, it seemed, pretty exponentially. Newspaper articles, sections of magazines, what have you. When the donors come back, what do you think that they'll be interested in? Well, not only was there sort of more coverage on philanthropy, but there was also money had remaining. So when donors come back, what do you think that they'll be interested in? Do you think that they'll have more interest in social services or international aid? I think it'll all go back to going to higher education. I just wonder if you think that the nonprofits will be prepared when the donors come back. If they'll be able to deal with the donors, or increased interest in knowing how their money was spent, et cetera, et cetera.
If anybody does not want to deal with a donor, send that donor to me.
I don't imagine that the nonprofits will not be prepared when the donors come back, but I actually think the donors are absolutely everywhere around us. If we imagine for a minute that the donors are not everywhere around us, then we lose traction. I want to say something about what will they be interested in. Here's what I've been noticing, is that I think that local foundations have gotten much more excruciatingly local. And what they're dealing with is what's happening in the community around them. I was just talking yesterday to somebody who runs a small foundation in Humboldt County, California, which is way rural and somewhat isolated. And you know, they're kind of on their own up there. It's not like a lot of people are coming in looking to invest in the county. And so what they've had to do is really watch what elements of the safety net system, of the advocacy system, et cetera, are hurting and need help at that moment. So they've gotten very, very local. I think that some of the national philanthropists, on the other hand, have taken off on special initiatives and have tied up large amounts of money on special initiatives. I don't honestly know where that's going to go. I think, you know, if history is any tutor, a number of those special initiatives are going to fail miserably, and there's going to be tens of millions of dollars gone out the window. So it's just, I think what we're looking at is we're almost looking at two different realms of philanthropy, one of which is looking at the dynamics of what's going on in communities and really trying to be a part of that. And another which is making up strategies, and they may be well-informed strategies, but they're making up the strategies and then selling those strategies to communities and to the Obama administration.
Wendy's on the ground working with fundraisers, probably more than any of us on this panel, so do you want to add some stuff about that?
I was just going to add, I think donors all have their own personal interest in terms of sectors. So not to that point, but in terms of your question of what they're looking for, I think particularly those high net worth individuals that are still giving, maybe they're giving less, maybe they're giving to fewer organizations, pooling their gifts and giving larger gifts to fewer organizations. I think they're looking for impact like never before. And I think they're looking at organizations in terms of investments like they never had before. I mean, we're coming off a time where people were holding their money close to their chest. Now they're giving a little bit more, and they're looking at it as an investment, and they want to know what you're going to provide in terms of return on that investment. So when we think about those high net worth individuals, those folks, not the national philanthropists that Ruth was speaking about, but those high net worth individuals that are in all of our communities that can make a big difference in a lot of different organizations. How do you position yourselves to be their philanthropic priority? And that's
Tom, did you also want to answer the question? Patrick,
Yeah,
so
I mean, I hesitate to prognosticate, but from my perspective, I mean, the real opportunity, as Ruth said, is at the local level. And, you know, I think even more than local, at the sub-community and neighborhood level. I mean, I think you really do have this dramatic loss of confidence in the ability of government to solve problems. And I think there is a real opportunity for the nonprofit sector to fill some of this gap by stepping into the role of assisting school systems develop their own Harlem Children's Zone sorts of models, and you know, developing the community clinics that can fill the gaps that are not going to be filled by our new health reform legislation. That's where the opportunity is.
Since I gave you a glib answer, I want to give you a sincere answer too. You know, one of the things, you know, in talking to some of our donors and to donors nationally is several people have said, look, my portfolio is way down right now. I'm not taking on any new initiatives. And in fact, and some donors have said, I'm reallocating all of my giving to feed the hungry and house the homeless. And so, you know, so Center on Philanthropy, don't expect anything from me right now, basically. And I suspect other arts, culture, educational institutions are getting some of that in return. How that plays out in the future will, I think, be a function of the donors' interest in how the other charities, the homeless shelters and the food banks and so on, how they steward the gifts from those donors and how they engage those donors, but also perceptions of need. I mean, one of the things colleges and universities have is grateful alumni. And when you look at, we report gifts of $1 million or more on our website every quarter, and one of the things we see is higher ed gets 45 to 55% of those gifts all the time. Well, you know, the local food bank is probably not going to get the gifts of $1 million or $5 million or $100 million typically, but there may be an evolution so that if you have that opportunity to engage that donor and do a good job with that, they may reallocate the priorities. But hard to tell.
Escobar at Georgetown University. This is in Cambridge. Basically, you pointed out the influence that geography has on the index of success of the donations. What do you think would be a good way to incorporate the more underserved sectors of the country?
I think it would be great if the council foundations really took that seriously over the next few years and really tried to direct money in the direction of rural philanthropy and areas that are underserved. I think there's been a lot of lip service to it that has not effectively really funneled large amounts of money in that direction. And I think we have to start taking the issue of equity seriously in the philanthropic world. I mean, presumably we understand we're a whole nation, and that we care about the nation as a whole nation, and I honestly, I think that it's the job of the Council of Foundations to really push that conversation forward in a way that has results and impact.
Okay.
I'm curious to know if you have any thoughts on the sort of hybrid area in the sector of the philanthropy and marketing, Pepsi Refresh or Target 5%, and the interaction that has with sort of social media for social good, and if you see that reflected in giving figures.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I guess by default I'll jump in. I think that this is an interesting phenomenon. I think that charities need to be careful about doing this because, in fact, you're co-branding. And the part that makes it attractive to the corporate sponsors is the perception that it creates that the corporations are doing good in collaboration or in partnership with the charity. And sometimes I think that those are good, authentic, legitimate things. And other times, though, the deal is struck in a way that very little dollars are transmitted from the point of sale to recipient organizations. And so I think that there, I'm in favor of full disclosure. I think there should be disclosure when you say some of these proceeds are given to charity. Well, what does some mean? Is that 1%? Is it 5%? Is it 1/10 of 1%? And I think that very rarely do the corporations and the charities reveal that. And I think that we need to move in that direction.
It's also creating a whole lot of energy and a whole lot of if you sit around a board table, many of our clients, their first conversations about fundraising will be what foundation should we approach and how should we approach corporations in the best ways. And so when you look at the overall picture, you're creating a whole lot of energy to go after these prizes, if you will, that in the end, corporate giving is 4% of that total pie. If you go back to that pie chart, 89% of the giving in this country is coming from individuals. So I think those boards around those tables that are spending the energy on getting that one corporate prize, if you will, if they were putting that same energy into approaching and cultivating those individual gifts, might see a greater return.
I wanna pile on to what Patrick said, which we've been tracking a lot in our newswire. These relationships gone awry. And PBS, Sesame Street just dumped McDonald's. An aquarium in Florida just had a hard time explaining that BP was sponsoring its sea otter exhibit. There's a significant downside if things go wrong. And right now, what I've noticed is that a lot of this is kind of focused around the issue of obesity. Is that you've got all these fast food companies that are sponsoring charity, and you may have a charity that's in Sesame Street's case, that it means the best for children, doesn't really want Ronald McDonald as a major spokesperson. And so, I think that, there just in some cases it may be a little bit of a deal with the devil. Pablo's ready to talk about a deal with the devil, I can tell on his face.
Pablo Eisenberg from Georgetown Public Policy Institute. I'd like to get to Ruth's very important point, namely that subsectors are not reflected accurately in the statistics. It's not so optimistic a picture when you think about poor people, people of color, disabled, women and children at risk, because we know that huge number of grassroots organizations, youth summer programs, hunger organizations, homeless organizations, neighborhood groups have suffered vast losses, and those are not really reflected, it seems to me, in Giving USA's statistics. So my question is, isn't it possible for both Giving USA and the Indiana Center, as well as the Center for Charitable Statistics, to begin to develop indicators that more accurately reflect these subsectors? It's very tough to define. The research will be difficult. But surely there's a better way to give a fuller picture of what's going on philanthropically than just the broad categories that exist. There should be some ways to measure low-income organizations, watchdog groups, and advocacy groups, et cetera. So is there anything underway from either of your two organizations to start developing these indicators that will more accurately reflect what's going on in this country?
Well, in terms of Giving USA, I want to reiterate that, so I'm going to disagree that the numbers are inaccurate. I'm going to say that that what's captured, though, is the aggregate numbers, and it's by subsector, and so we are very careful to say we are not explaining or predicting what happens in your organization or your organization. We're explaining and predicting what's happening overall. I fully agree that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the nonprofit sector, and that's, you know, a good thing. You know, there's winners and losers, and that's, you know, that's life. There's equity issues, and I agree, Pablo, that that's something that needs to be addressed. The problem with doing this in Giving USA, though, is that the IRS data don't reflect donations to specific organizations. They reflect aggregate donations, and so it'd be hard to use IRS data that we use for Giving USA to do that. It's something that NCCS might tackle in time. I don't know if you want to.
We actually do have a lot of these data on our website currently. We've spent a good amount of time exploring how to do a report like you described. You know, I think we can do something like that, but there are a lot of challenges, particularly when you look at some of the difference between a community theater that is in an affluent neighborhood and one that is an underserved neighborhood, and thinking through what that means in terms of how you want to be thinking about the role it plays in the community. But I expect we will do something along these lines in the next year.
You know, I want to say something about, you know, when the more you look at it, the more complicated the endeavor of trying to figure out who's getting what becomes. I've been watching what's been happening with community health centers really carefully, and it's been this very weird picture because there was a huge amount of investment that went into them in terms of stimulus money. But the whole middle of the country was excluded in one round of that. And so you have these, and a good part of that money was actually organized around not just increased need, but facilities development, because in anticipation of health reform passing, and in IT, in kind of electronic records development. And so you really you have to really carefully track what it is. And then, even in the states that did get additional money, stimulus money, like in California, California immediately withdrew its money from the health center. So there was this kind of shell game going on. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about fits and starts. It's like a Wild West in some communities of nonprofits, and so I think it is difficult to track. But I do think you have to dig down to really understand what's at risk, because I think there are whole fields that are at serious risk right now, and we're not doing a very good job across this country of naming who they are.
Thank you. Hi, Patricia Pascal, Foundation Center here in Washington. When you talked about why individual giving didn't go down as much as we all feared in 2009, do you think that social media was part of the reason keeping the issues in front of people, and not so much that people gave through it, but did you look at the effect on individuals, because we all saw it everywhere, and it seemed to really blossom from the people coming into our libraries and using it more in order to get the word out about the dire straits. I was wondering if anybody looked at that.
Yeah, we have done studies of disaster giving following the attack on America, following Katrina, following tsunami, and following Haiti and Chile. But in each of the prior ones, except for Haiti, we've participated with other partners to do surveys of households about how much they gave and the average gift and so on. And one of the things that we see is the average gift is $125 to $135 per household that gives something at all to each disaster. The median is $50. And so what you see is kind of a stimulus from this disaster, kind of an empathetic response, and people are giving relatively small amounts. I mean, $50 is the median gift. You know, let's face it, you can blow $50 going out for pizza or anything else. So I don't think people are reallocating their philanthropy around that disaster relief giving. The thing that is interesting that we have not studied and haven't gotten funding to, but I would like to, is the giving following Haiti, disaster relief giving, and the role of these texting gifts, because a lot of the phone companies have set up gifts of $5, $10, or $20. So my hypothesis going into that is actually that the social media, the media texting type of giving is going to lower the average gift from what it has been historically, because now it may expand participation, which is wonderful, but that's not creating a relationship with those donors, right? Because the charities are getting gifts from the phone companies, from the text messages from their clients. They're not creating a donative pool for future fundraising efforts. So although I'm not advocating against it, I'm just saying empirically I think it's going to lower the average.
Can I say one other thing? I'm sorry, but you know, one of the other things that's happened with that kind of giving is that there are increasing numbers of scams that are occurring, and the FBI says that it's becoming increasingly difficult to track down who's running those scams because of the more and more mobile nature of technology. And so you just wonder, you know, at what point are people going to get too scared? What I hear, some of the messaging is you should know who it is you're giving to first, which I would make me think that those kinds of donations would be headed towards the more kind of branding charities rather than, and so you heard after Haiti a lot of discomfort with the way giving was being allocated and who it was going to in the wake of that disaster. And so, you know, you don't know how this stuff is actually going to end up because there's so many kind of unanticipated consequences.
Yeah. Just from my perspective, I think once again the opportunity is in figuring out how to build sustained relationships with donors, and I think, you know, the Web 2.0 stuff is nice, but it really doesn't get us there. You know, if you look at the needs in Haiti, for example, they're not going away in 6 months, so that sudden spurt of gifts just really doesn't get you where you need to go. Same is true domestically.
And while the reports have been anywhere from 3 to 8%, overall online giving is still a very small percentage of how gifts are being given.
Hi, I'm Laura Smothers, and I am a graduate student at Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. And I'm also interning at the Corporation for National and Community Service. And I actually just had a question. You talked about how nonprofits are focusing more on the impact that they're making. So there seems to be a push in the nonprofit sector to measure outcomes and performance. But in a recent study done by British researchers, more than half of the financial donor behavior was not affected by performance information. And I think you guys kind of read about that study. So what do you think that says about philanthropy in general? And do you think that donors will change their behavior and start to consider nonprofit performance when they give money?
Yeah, Tom and I partnered on a study several years ago looking at fundraising costs and overhead costs in charities. And if you believe the surveys, I think it was something like 79% of households said that it was really important to know the fundraising costs and the overhead costs of the charity. But, you know, I tell you, I've made a personal commitment to give 10% of my income, and I do absolutely no due diligence on how much organizations spend on OPEC. And at the end of the day, I really don't care. You know, I'm giving to organizations I believe in their mission, I think they're doing good work, and you kind of do it intuitively, heuristically, by who's on the board, what are they doing, are there any scandals, do you trust them? I mean, this is, you know, I think Ruth made the point about unrestricted gifts. I mean, I think unrestricted gifts are a question of trust. Do you trust the organization to use the money well? And so, now, that said, there are, in this era of philanthrocapitalists and high impact giving and all this kind of stuff, there will be individual donors for whom that is a big deal, and that you better be able to demonstrate impact, and I think it's very difficult. And one of the things about the for-profit sector is, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether or not you're making steel, tires, or software, you got ROI, and you can measure that, and there is, you know, dollars are immutable, right? You can measure that across any industry. In the nonprofit sector, how do you compare what an art institution is doing compared to a university, compared to a grassroots organization that's, you know, teaching local kids how to read or feeding, you know, people in a poor neighborhood? So I'm all in favor of impact. I like the concept. I get it, but guess what? Difficult work.
In our work, I think we see a lot of Patricks out there, that there are nonprofits wrapped up in this outcome conversation and probably fueled by funders to some extent. But in the end, what a nonprofit cares about is what their donor considers impact. And so that's what the conversation needs to be focused around. As a donor, if you want my major gift, you need to talk to me about the kind of work you're doing that resonates with me. What kind of outcome am I interested in, and what is impact to me? What is return on investment to me as your potential donor?
I think there's also recognition, certainly where I work at the Urban Institute, in the importance of using outcome measurement as a critical management tool. But that's different from saying we must be comparing, you know, the arts organization to the homeless shelter. You know, it's using it as a management tool, developing, you know, peer groups within particular fields is really vital for, I think, moving the sector forward. But I completely agree with Patrick in terms of its utility for informing donor decisions.
You know what I liked? I think it was that study, I'm not sure, but it had a list of how people got that their information, and pretty high on that list was, you know, somebody who benefited from the organization and they told you it was good. You know, there's something in that that is extremely important. You know, in the end, this is about relationships and trust. And it's about being able to feel the results that you want to see from the organization. So you know, I think the results orientation, I actually feel like a good part of that conversation. I do agree with Tom. I think it's a great management tool. I think we should all be using those tools to evaluate our own stuff. Is that the reason I think people give? Absolutely not. Not a lot of people.
I think I can probably speak loud enough. Peter Wolf, I've been a fundraiser for the last 20 years, and it seems to me that we've all been talking around an issue here that needs exploration, and that is, how do we as a sector make ourselves better understood? We really are one of the most misunderstood sectors in this society, as demonstrated by something like the Grassland Committee a few years ago, which made a big splash with a few specific cases, all of which have been covered by present law, or most of them, 92% I think of the cases that the Grassland Committee uncovered were covered by present law. And momentarily, there was the thought, oh, we can increase our tax revenue by going after the nonprofit sector. I think we as a sector do a very poor job of explaining ourselves. We have two journalists up there. Maybe they can address that.
I completely agree. You know, when I started actually publishing a magazine, was the first time that my parents really knew what to ask me when I came in the house. Because they understood magazine. Some of the other stuff I got up to, they didn't really get. So I think, you know, I do believe, I don't think that people truly understand who we are and how we work. And that some of the false conversation that goes on in Washington about what's important to us and what our priorities should be, and, you know, all of that, it just obfuscates things. It just confuses people. I wish we could get down to brass tacks and just explain to our neighbors how important this sector is to the quality of community life.
I would actually break that question into two pieces. I think one is, how do you explain large organizations and their dynamics? And I think, you know, the work that's been done comparing large for-profit and non-profit hospitals, that unfortunately doesn't show huge differences in many cases, you know, is very telling. I think until we deal with issues like that among large organizations, it's pretty tough to make that case. Among small organizations, quite frankly, what I see is smaller organizations are wrestling to get their program work done. I was working on a project last summer, going door to door in a community in DC, and what we found in talking to the people in the community about the nonprofit organizations that serve them is that many people really are not aware of, the nonprofit next door. Not for reasons having to do with any lack of good work by the nonprofits, but simply because they're too busy doing their program to do the kind of outreach to become some true grassroots organizations that we would all like them to become. So I think, more work on nonprofits collaborating at a local level to kind of get their message out is the key.
I think if you, so to pile on further, I think one of the challenges is the media in terms of, we have industry media here, so they can, they have to go and talk about what's really going on in the sector, right?
And we like to.
And like to, and, but, that's their core job, right? But for the regular mainstream media, I think that when you think about the aphorism, if it bleeds, it leads, nonprofits are inherently about doing good work to help make society a better place, right? Well, that makes us feel good, and it is good. It's important. That's why we exist. That's why many of us are working in the sector. And yet, that's not newsworthy by, it doesn't compare to, this double murder homicide and, all these kinds of things that are more newsworthy. I think, and I bring that up to say, one of the reasons we're misunderstood is we're more likely to be covered in the mainstream media if there's a scandal than we are if we're doing good work.
Yeah, I've obviously had too much coffee this morning. I know I'm talking a lot. I did have too much coffee this morning, but I want to say we've been doing this nonprofit newswire for the past year or more. And what we do every single night is we scour the news reports for what's going on in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector, and also in state budgets to try to, kind of keep people up to date in what's happening in their context. Here's what we found, that there are some states who do an absolutely fabulous, relatively a fabulous job reporting on the nonprofit sector, and there are some states where there is a virtual blackout. So if you look at California, you look at Florida, you look at Minnesota, you look at Hawaii, you can get reports. New Jersey, they're great at reporting on what's going on in the sector. New York, great. Washington, D.C., great. There are whole sections of the country where you might see an article every month that has something to do and is very vague and obviously is not very informed about what it's reporting about. So we really do have a serious problem with the media. It may partially have to do with the fact that in some of those states, you may have people mostly picking up AP reports to put in the newspaper, and that there is not a whole lot of money in local reporting. But the fact of the matter is there is a virtual blackout across most of this country as far as what nonprofits are doing in the community.
But now that so many journalistic organizations are going nonprofit, I have a feeling they'll start talking a lot more.
Hopefully.
Anyway, so I expect to see change, actually. We probably have time for 2 quick questions, so who wants to get them? You have a chance to ask a question.
Could you speak up? We can't hear it all.
People can't hear in the back.
The international affairs sector is recession resilient, and it has been growing fairly steady over the past 30 years from summary. Is there something in particular that organizations are doing to attract donors, or is it just becoming more sexy in a sense? Is it more newsworthy? What is driving this growth, and do you foresee it continuing post-recession?
The Giving to International the international subsector, including disaster relief, is in fact one of the fastest growing subsectors since 1987 when Giving USA started tracking it. And I attribute it to a couple things. I mean, one of the things is 911. I think you see a huge burst in giving to international organizations following the attack on America. And I think, you know, there were a lot of collateral damages that came with the attack on America, obviously, but there was one collateral benefit is that we started thinking about our role in society being more globally and perhaps being proactively and thinking about maybe reaching out and helping others around the world in a preventative manner, perhaps. I think the other piece of it is that because of media attention following not just Katrina, but the tsunami, Chile, Haiti, and so on, that Americans have reached in and been a little more empathetic to those who are needy around the world because, and I have to say, the media have really done a great job in capturing our attention on this, in showing, you know, again, if it bleeds, it leads, but in showing the dire circumstances of people affected and afflicted by those disasters, and so I think that's been a part of it. So, you know, to answer post-recession, I would say yes, I think that this is an area that percentage-wise will continue to grow above average.
Hi, I work with Julia, and we published the Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances, which I know some of you have written about and come to. I just wanted to address just a data issue, a methodology issue, which I think is important, but I think it also reflects kind of a bigger issue too, of how we're going to keep a handle on international giving with the rise in technology and more internet giving and global giving. But first of all, we always get asked the question, and I want to just use this opportunity to explain why our absolute number that we measure is higher than yours. And I think what is only through what we talk to also that our methodology starts too. Main reason, if anybody cares about numbers, it used to be numbers every crowd, is that because we use the tax deductions, and we go to our surveys, we capture money that is going from the U.S. directly to organizations overseas, which people don't put down for tax deductions. So that's one of the big things that creates the difference. And secondly, in the categories that people report to the IRS, the way it's categorized, if a group is predominantly domestic, that all of the donations to that group are listed as domestic, even though a significant part of their giving might be international. So we have that problem too. So American Red Cross, I think, is something domestic, because primary activity is domestic, but yet that their international money isn't going into their international section. And that's what our number for 2008 was 37 billion for international giving, and yours was, I think, 13.3 billion. But I think, and then we also measure the value of volunteer time, and we measure the amount that universities give in scholarships to students coming from that. So that's in case anyone was wondering, that is sort of the main reason. I think what is interesting is that what is going to happen when more and more money is going to the internet, even here domestically in the U.S. And granted, most of that goes to organizations. We do have to report it on one time, but a lot of it's still going to go into individuals and groups that may not be getting reported. So I think it's a changing world out there and how giving is being done, and a changing world in how it's gathered and how we measure it is becoming increasingly more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, just on the methodology, I mean, we're going to capture, if it's giving to a charity, we'll capture whether it's given by texting or by on the internet or by mail or phone or whatever. That part doesn't matter. What does matter, though, and I think one of the reasons the numbers are different as well, is remittances can also be not only to foreign-based organizations, but directly to other individuals. And so if you do a survey of individuals and you ask them about remittances, one of my colleagues, Una Conquasili, has done a lot of work on remittances around the world, and a lot of it's individual to individual or individual to community back home, and that's not going to be captured in Giving USA because that's not a tax-deductible gift, whether it's a gift to an individual abroad or a gift to an individual in the United States. That's informal philanthropy. We don't devalue that. It's still important. We still think that's great, but that's not part of Giving USA. We're trying to measure and count formal philanthropy in the United States.
I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to wrap up, and I apologize. But so we end on more questions than we have answers, but I think we've gotten a lot of answers today. And I want to thank our panel for their tremendous observations.